If you're wondering how to create cinematic photographs like these, you've come to the right place. Now, I actually love taking cinematic photos, which basically means taking photos that look like scenes or stills from a movie. In cinematic photography, it's all about creating a narrative and telling a story. And I'm going to share my 3 top strategies to do that in this video. My very first tip for cinematic photography is to start with an emotion. Because think about it, why do we actually watch movies? We might say we want to be entertained, maybe distracted from the everyday, sure, but what's actually beneath that? Usually it's because we want to feel something. So there could be either positive emotions, like joy if you're watching a funny comedy, or it could even be feelings like sadness or fear. I mean, a lot of people love horror movies, and of course nobody wants to feel scared in real life, but in the cinema it's kind of fun because it's a controlled environment, so it can actually be very enjoyable. And so, going back to photography, one of the easiest ways to create a cinematic photo is to think about the emotion you want the viewer of the picture to feel. I'm going to show you an example so you can see what I mean. In this photo, I wanted the viewer to feel some sort of compassion or sadness. So I used this teddy bear and I ripped it apart. Sorry, I stitched it back up afterwards. And before the shoot, when I thought about how to stage it, what lighting to use, what props to use, I always had these emotions of sadness, empathy in mind. So for your shoot, before you actually start taking the photo, it can be really helpful to sit down and answer the following questions. Number 1, we've talked about it already. What emotion do you want the viewer to feel when they look at your picture? Question number 2, is there a specific framing you could use to portray that emotion? For example, think about the classic shot of a lone figure in a field or by the sea or something like that. That can often portray loneliness or isolation. Then the third question you could ask yourself, especially if you're working with a model or photographing yourself, how can you portray that emotion through body language, makeup, and clothing? Just an example, somebody who's sad, they're not going to sit upright, like this. They're going to kind of cave inwards a bit, they're going to have droopy shoulders. So try to always think about this kind of stuff when you're trying to convey an emotion. Then the fourth question you can ask yourself before you do your photo shoot is, are there certain technical settings you could use to convey the emotion? For example, you could use a slow shutter speed to show that the subject of the photo is sort of confused or even in despair. And then the last question you could ask yourself is, are there certain universal symbols you could use? Classic one is the bird symbolizing freedom. Could also be candles, flowers, that sort of thing. Right, and then the second method you could use to create cinematic photos is storytelling. Let me just explain that quickly. Think about the regular photographer. They will often take a photo of something that's beautiful or interesting. They're not thinking about a narrative, they just want to represent reality as it is. For example, they're taking a photo of a really beautiful waterfall, of a nice landscape, of a bird, whatever. Now, when you're trying to do cinematic photography, you always want to think about a narrative behind the picture. Again, it really helps to ask yourself a few questions before you do your photo shoot. You can actually kind of think like a filmmaker in this case. You want to decide beforehand who is the main character, where are they, what are they doing. And by the way, this doesn't have to be a person. It can also be an animal, it could be a stuffed toy, anything that can be the subject of any kind of story. Another way to do this is that you could tell a story through a still life. So before you arrange this still life, think about who do these objects belong to? Are they new? Are they showing signs of use? Where exactly are they placed? Whose environment is it, basically? And again, think about symbolism here. What exactly do those objects represent? You can even actually use objects to hint at the presence of somebody that isn't in the frame anymore. A good example of this is using a candle. So you light the candle, then you blow it out, and then you take the photo just in that moment. And it looks like somebody just blew out the candle because there's still a bit of smoke there. And then finally, the third method you can use to create cinematic images is color. So color is one of the most important elements in photography anyway. But if you're going for a cinematic vibe in your photos, it really helps to think strategically about color. In movie making and in photography actually, this is called color grading. And that simply means that you're intentionally manipulating the colors in your image to achieve a certain mood or effect. Let me just show you some examples of color grading in images. Now, I think color grading is a bit of an art form, and I do have some tips to get better at it. Number 1 is very simple, just watch some more movies. Because almost every movie these days is heavily color graded, just think, for example, of the Wes Anderson movies that have these sickly sweet pastel colors, or horror movies will often have very blue tones in the shadows and kind of yellow orangey in the highlights. So next time you watch a movie, really pay attention to how the colors are used in it. My next color grading tip is to think about color psychology. Surely you've heard of this before. For example, the color blue is very often associated with sadness, melancholy, or then you have the color red, which sort of stands for passion or love. This can of course vary depending on your cultural background. But if you just Google color psychology, you can get lots of articles on the topic. And using colors in this way can be really effective for cinematic photography. Next, if you want to do color grading in your images, I would highly recommend you do some color grading in Photoshop or any other editing software. I've actually done a whole video on this subject. I'm going to put it here and also link it in the description. And then another way you can use color grading in your images is to basically do it in camera, as it were, and to use colored light. One thing that comes to mind straight away for me is neon lighting, because that's really often used in movies and has a super cinematic look. So if you're a street photographer, really look out for those neon lights. If you're taking photos at home, you can use colored gels. I have some here. It's these kind of plastic sheets that come in different colors. And you place them in front of your light source. And then you get these super cool color casts on the subject's face. Another really fun tool is a sunset lamp. This is what they look like. They're pretty cheap and they create this super cool effect that basically looks like a sunset, and you can also change the colors. So that might be another fun option to play with. That's it for today. Make sure to subscribe. See you next time.